Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about considerations for miking a drum kit before the session even starts. So what we have here is a drum kit fully set up, and I have a bunch of mics on stands that I'll be using for a session. There are some very important things to consider when picking your mics, which we're not going to talk about too much here. We're going to talk more about placement and considerations that you need to be mindful of before the drummer ever shows up. So the first thing that I need to point out is that this is kind of just a standard setup for a drum kit right here. We're talking about distance between the drums themselves and the cymbals. That's a rough estimate right there. I know for a fact that when the drummer comes in, they're going to tweak and move things to their liking. So me putting mics, especially close mics, right on the pieces now is not going to make a lot of sense because I'm going to have to move them out of the way when the drummer comes in and starts fiddling around with things. So what we've done here is set up the mics around the kit, but in a rough proximity to where they'll need to go. So I can kind of start with some basic things pretty much from the top of the input list that I'd like to point out, and maybe you'll consider in your career as well. The one piece of the drum kit that I know will not be moving is the kick drum. So we can get the kick drum as dialed in as possible ahead of time. The inside mic that we're using here on the kick drum, frankly, it's not, to me, super critical what mic I'm going to use there. I can use EQ to kind of get the sound that I need out of that inside mic a lot of the times, especially if it's not something like an old AKG D12 that has got that sound about it. I don't have the luxury of having that here at the studio, so we're gonna just use this biodynamic kick drum mic. Now I wanna capture some of the beater sound for a couple of reasons. One, to be able to trigger off of samples, and two, because that is the best mic to use, I think, in the headphone mix. The click and the attack is what you really want to come through in the headphones because everyone really cues off of the kick and the snare. It's very important with the inside kick drum mic to remember that the batter side head, while you may visualize it as a wall that blocks sound coming into it, it really doesn't do that. We're talking about a very thin plastic material that's 10 to 20 millimeters thick that is what's lying between not just the beater head, but also the bottom of the snare. So if you were to come at the kick drum and put the kick in mic pointed across this direction, you've not only turned it into a kick in mic, you've also turned it into a snare bottom mic. I would prefer to not do that. I'd prefer to have my kick in mic angled more toward the floor tom because frankly, the side of the floor tom is going to be much less offensive than the bottom of the snare. So we've come in on this kind of angle and then kicked the microphone back towards the beater and up towards the floor tom there. With the kick out mic, since we're using the kick in mic to get a lot of that beater snap already, I'm not going to have that kick out mic directed straight at the beater. That would be a redundancy that I really don't feel the need for. However, I find it's really great to get that kick out mic about a third of the way down from the top of the drum, and then you get a nice full-bodied woof kind of sound out of it. I'm a big fan personally of using a microphone for the kick out. I know a lot of folks like using a sub kick or something of that variety. This works well for me, and since this is a very basic setup, I'm gonna go with what I know. I'll throw a Beta 52 with the blue line lining up just at about the edge of the drum itself. We've taken the resonant side head off to cut down on overtones. And for the style of music that this will be covering, which is more of a classic country style, removing the resonant head is gonna get me closer to the kind of sound that I want out of this kick drum. Probably the most important microphone to have away from the kit is the snare drum mic. There's a lot of action going on around where the snare drum mic stand sits. You've got the hi-hat stand, you've got the snare stand, and then you've got the tom, maybe a crash stand, a whole bunch of pieces living over in that area. And we're just gonna get that mic totally out of the way altogether, but have it set up at about the right height that you're gonna be using with about the right angle on the boom. That way, with any luck, you're able to drop that mic in and all you have to adjust is the vertical aspect of that stand. With the rack tom mic, I like to work at right angles with the stand. So that means we've got a vertical and then a horizontal plane, and that's really all I want to have to deal with. So I've got this stand set up so that if I go 90 degrees right here, that's gonna be right at the spot that I would like to have that microphone sitting relative to the tom. Now, if the tom itself moves front, back, up, down, I've got my front and back right here. I've got my up and down right here. Piece of cake. Depending on the weight of the microphone that you're going to use on the rack tom, you'll also want to put the boom so that it extends out over one of the legs of the stand. That'll give you more stability, and it will frankly make it easier to place the microphone. That leg can sit right underneath the kick drum, between the kick drum leg and the side of the drum itself. Gives you a lot of flexibility and really compacts your setup. A lot of times the drummer will adjust the height, angle, and distance away from other parts of the kit of the floor tom. I like to give them as much space as possible to do that, but again, we're trying to have things close in proximity so it's easy to get to when the time comes to actually mic up the kit. We have a 421 here, which is a classic tom mic, but there's a couple of downsides to using a 421. If this drummer so decides to move a ride or a crash around the proximity of where I'd want to put that 421, we've got a big extension here on the back of the microphone where the XLR cable comes out, which doesn't allow a lot of vertical clearance for that. Fortunately, in this circumstance, we're going to be in good shape. I'm able to approach the drum from the side a little bit and then use an angle on the microphone to reject some of the ride and the crash. So if this were the final setup here, I could go ahead and swing this microphone in, and we could go underneath some legs from the cymbal stands, get it placed in a good spot where we get some rejection out of it, and then we'd see how that sounds. It's really important to use the correct sized stand for the job. It drives me crazy when I see a floor tom or a snare mic'd up with a regular sized tripod stand. It's very ugly to walk in and look at, and it's frankly really difficult to get a good placement. You also need to crank down on that stand tremendously to get it to stay in that proper spot. If you use the right stand for the job, everything is really easy. This overhead setup is something that I've been doing for quite a while now. This is a pair of N22 active ribbon mics by AEA, and they've really suited me well for overheads. A common consideration with setting up overheads is that much like the kick drum, you can get those dialed in and set up at the right spot before anyone shows up. There's a very good chance that there's not going to be a lot of action going on up above the drummer's head once they get here and start moving things, so that's something you can lock into place ahead of time. By putting the overheads about 3 to 4 feet away from the snare drum, you're able to get a very good phase relationship that cuts out muddy frequencies and illuminates high frequencies. That's a general height that we have this set at right now, somewhere between 3 and 4 feet from the top of the snare, and that's going to have that kind of positive effect for us. You may also notice that I have these on an atypical angle from what you might see from a normal overhead setup. A lot of times you'll see overhead mics, especially a stereo pair, come from the front and the back and connect in the middle so that you're getting very much the left side and the right side of the kit with that style of imaging. For my purposes, I prefer to set these up on an angle. And this angle is designed to put the snare and the kick drum dead in the middle of the stereo image. I've found that by having a coincident pair like this directly over the drummer's head will give you a very snare left side heavy, kick drum right side heavy image. I would really like to center those two in the overhead image, and additionally we'll get a nice spread of the entire kit if we take everything on an angle. The goal with this angle of the overheads is that we're trying to cut the snare drum in half right through the tom and the ride. So I want the left overhead to cover this tom, crash, hi-hat, and this half of the snare, while the right overhead covers the other half of the snare, the ride, this crash, and the floor tom. What that also will give us in the stereo imaging is a more extreme separation of the toms themselves. My biggest issue with the direct overhead technique is that the rack tom ends up pretty much dead in the middle of the stereo image, when traditional mixing techniques tell you to push that rack tom a little bit to the left. So if we look at the drum kit here, the center of the drum kit, as per what I am looking at, is this kick drum right here, and the snare is on the left-hand side in the same plane as the rack tom. If we were to put an overhead pair directly over the drummer's head, in the traditional sense, we would get a pretty centered kick drum, but a lot of snare and rack tom kind of on the left side of middle, with a really extreme separation of the hi-hat and the right side crash that I'm not necessarily looking for. If we're able to put the overheads along this plane right here, I can get the hi-hat closer to center and center up the snare drum and the kick drum so the image is nice and full once I start bringing my close mics into the mix. The goal here is to have the left overhead capture this half of the snare along with the rack, left side crash, and hi-hats, while the right side overhead catches this half of the snare, the ride, the right side crash, and the floor tom. That way, when we hard pan, we're going to have a more extreme separation of the toms, a centered snare, a more directed hi-hat, and we'll have the ride at a really nice point between the toms. That gives us the ability to push the crashes as far wide as possible. Over the years, I've grown to really enjoy putting a small cap condenser on the ride. Now you'll notice that I use the overheads for the crashes and the hi-hat, but the ride I find, based on its proximity and general loudness, will often need a little bit of help in the mix. So by placing a ride mic near the bell itself, I can get a lot of snap on that I can blend into the mix if there's any delicate ride content happening from the drummer. So the room mics that I'm using here, it's another ribbon pair, and I've got them set up in a Bloomline configuration. This is about 8 or 9 feet away from the snare drum. And what that is going to let us do is get another very positive phase relationship where we're able to naturally get rid of muddy frequencies by inverting the phase on these mics here. Additionally, I'm using a very similar principle to what I used with the overhead mics, which is trying to put the kick drum and the snare in the middle of the stereo image. So I've taken a line through the snare, through the kick drum, and come right over here to my room mics. Thanks for watching. I hope this was useful for you and you found some tips and tricks that you can start applying to your drum miking. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment below about things you would like to learn about in the future.